Thank you. First, I want to thank members of the committee on both sides of the aisle who have requested that we have this important hearing. We're going to focus specifically on our cattle markets today. Many of us have heard from producers concerned with the lack of transparency and competition. These farmers and ranchers also raise concerns about concentration in the packing industry, potential market manipulations, lack of access to small and mid-sized plants, and a range of other issues. This is a really important conversation as the committee considers reauthorization of the Livestock Mandatory Reporting Act, and clearly a need for greater transparency and competition in the marketplace. And we need to make sure that livestock producers of all sizes have options, both in normal times and during unprecedented times like we've seen in the last 18 months. As I've said when we started today, we need to keep exploring ways to make our livestock supply chain and our food supply chain as a whole more resilient. Reacting to specific events, whether it's a pandemic or a hack or extreme weather, isn't enough. We need to build a food supply chain better able to withstand these future disruptions, whatever they are. The pandemic made clear how really important this is. Early last year, shifts in demand forced producers to plow under crops and dump milk. At the same time, consumers panicked at empty store shelves, and food banks faced lines of waiting cars a mile long. Compounding this disaster was the failure of many meat processors to adequately protect their workers from COVID-19, resulting in tens of thousands of cases and hundreds of deaths. These outbreaks caused plants to shutter and forced many producers to euthanize animals they couldn't get to market. The price livestock producers received plummeted while consumer prices surged. Many of the vulnerabilities exposed by the pandemic still exist. We were reminded of that in May when a ransomware attack froze all of Brazilian-owned JBS's Northern American processing. One attack on one company halted 1/5 of U.S. meat processing capacity. And the issue was only resolved, according to reports, after JBS paid $11 million in ransom. Concentration and consolidation clearly play a large role in many issues affecting the industry. For example, USDA's Packers and Stockyards Division data show that 4 companies account for 85% of fed cattle slaughter. There is a widening gap between those giant players and the small and medium-sized processors that many local farmers and ranchers count on. So, what happens when farmers and ranchers have fewer options? What are the immediate effects? And what are the unintended consequences? Those are the questions I hope we can begin to answer today. I'd now like to turn to my friend, Ranking Member Bozeman.
The U.S. cattle industry has a storied history. It is the backbone of many rural economies and represents the largest segment of agriculture in many parts of the country. In 2019, 14% of the beef produced in the U.S. was exported, generating $8.1 billion in value. By comparison, in 1990, only 4% of the beef produced in the U.S. was exported. Nearly 85% of the beef produced in the U.S. is grading prime or choice. In 2007, only about 50% of our beef earned these grades. This improvement in quality is due to producers making investments in their herds, in genetics, management, and feeding practices to produce higher quality and more diverse products for the global consumer base. These investments are being made across every segment of this complex and interconnected industry, from the cow-calf producer to the backgrounder, packer, and further processor to provide the wholesaler, retailer, exporter, and ultimately the consumer a growing variety of nutritious beef products. The ribeye I'm having for dinner tonight was derived from a steer that was conceived over 2.5 years ago. And when any one segment of this industry experiences an unexpected event, like the fire at the beef plant in Holcomb, Kansas in 2019, it ripples through the entire supply chain. When every segment of the cattle industry experienced the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, that ripple effect was amplified in a manner that has been unmatched throughout modern history. New challenges are now confronting this industry. A worsening drought in the West that is creeping into the plains, increasing input costs, severe labor shortages that are limiting utilization of packing capacity, supply chain challenges at our ports. The past 2 years have been some of the most difficult this sector has ever experienced. Mounting frustration is resulting in calls for widespread reform of the cattle industry due to these difficulties. We must carefully consider reforms in response to the exceptional black swan events that have occurred since 2019 and the consequences, both intended and unintended, of such actions. We're hearing questions about whether current market conditions allow for adequate price discovery for fed cattle and the effect that a thinning cash market could be having throughout the supply chain. I thank all of our witnesses for their participation in this important hearing and helping this committee learn about this multifaceted industry and the unique challenges that it faces. Madam Chair, I have received several letters and written testimony from cattle producers and stakeholder groups who are interested in today's hearing. I request unanimous consent to include these documents for the record.
Without objection.
And with that, I yield back.
I'll turn first to Senator Thune for our first introduction.
So I'm delighted that you have called this hearing and look forward to hearing from all our witnesses, but I in particular want to recognize a panelist who is here from my home state of South Dakota, and I want to welcome to the committee Mr. Justin Tupper from St. Ange, South Dakota. And Justin is a cow-calf producer who also serves as Vice President of the United States Cattlemen's Association. In addition to his cow-calf operation, Justin manages the St. Ange Livestock auction, and I have been there on a few of those Fridays for those cattle sales.
Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today. We appreciate both the chairwoman and the ranking member for coming together in a bipartisan manner to host this hearing. This is definitely a producer issue. It's not a partisan issue, so we thank you. I'm privileged to be here representing cattle producers and independent meat processors across the U.S. This hearing is critical because there is a crisis in rural America. We are losing our producers at an alarming rate, all the while watching big corporate feeders, packers make record profits with the threat of vertical integration hanging over our head. As cattle producers, we are natural stewards of the land. These family farms, ranchers work day in, day out to produce a high-quality protein product in a safe and sustainable way. As we sit here today, producers in my state and across the country are enduring devastating drought conditions. This is just one of the many challenges cattle producers face year in and year out. All the while managing the land, borrowing money to keep the operation running, fighting drastic shifts in weather, and dealing with the rising input costs and a fallen bottom line. Most ranchers who sell their calves at weaning time are selling those calves for less than $1,000 a head. That's somewhere near $100 a head profit after all input costs and amounts to less than a 1% return on investment, an incredible risky business. For those who raise and sell all the way to fat cattle, calving to finish, a finished steer is worth somewhere around $1,600 a head today. Packers could buy that steer, process it, and sell it for beef alone, not counting byproducts, for over $2,800 a head today, for a gross margin profit of over 80%. We as cattle producers understand and want the packer to make money. That makes the whole system work. But since 2015, corporate packers' gross margin has ballooned from an average of $100 to $200 a head to well over $1,000 a head. Packers have enjoyed unbelievable profits, harvesting around 120,000 head per day, while cattle producers go out of business and consumers pay double or even triple at the meat counter. Cattle producers, when they make money, they reinvest in their local community, buying and upgrading equipment, paying more for feeder cattle, reinvesting in the land through conservation practices. The corporate packer does not reinvest in the industry or sometimes even in country. Of the 4 companies that harvest about 85% of the U.S. fed cattle, 2 of those, JBS and National Beef, are owned and operated outside the United States and Brazil. The main goal of these corporations is not to reinvest in our land or our people, but to create value for their shareholders. Not to mention, the Big Four packers are also heavily invested in our direct competition, plant-based and lab-grown alternative proteins. The packers' increased control of supply of cattle solely committed to one packer has made it nearly impossible to have active price discovery. In my years as an auctioneer and operating St. Ange Livestock, I've learned the most important participant in true price discovery is the second bidder. In most cases in the fat cattle trade today, we don't have a second bidder. So producers see huge losses in equity while the packer reaps all the rewards despite having the least amount of risk and owning the product the least amount of time, while exploiting producers and ultimately the consumer. Producers cannot be sustainable or generational without being profitable. Building a safe and secure food supply starts with ensuring the success of our food producers. These cattle markets are very complex. We know this, but when there is an oligopoly with 4 packers controlling the industry, there are only 2 ways to level the playing field. We can either work to eliminate the occurrence of anti-competitive practices and market manipulation in the meatpacking sector, or as we've seen done in the past in other industries, we can break them up so they cannot have as much influence or ownership in the market. We don't take these challenges lightly. We believe these are critical times. The United States Cattlemen Association, of whom I am testifying on behalf of today, is fighting to secure our food supply system, our rural communities, and our members' livelihoods.
My name is Mark Gardner from Ashland, Kansas, and I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to visit today. This is a very important topic for the U.S. beef industry, and I am very pleased to represent beef producers who are committed to the industry to raise the safest and highest quality beef in the world. I am a 5th-generation rancher whose 12 family members are all involved in our beef production. Today, our topic is complicated. The cause of this issue is not. A processing plant fire, a pandemic, and a ransomware attack caused extraordinary disruption in processing, resulting in a dramatic drop of the processed beef supply and a bulging oversupply of live cattle. This caused an unprecedented drop in cattle prices while simultaneously leading to a record rise in beef prices. Let's look at our industry history. From 1980 to 1995, we were the very picture of an industry in trouble. Consumer satisfaction was at an all-time low, and we were losing market share at a rate that put us in peril of being an irrelevant protein. This loss of market share and dissatisfaction was rooted in the production sector. In other words, producers had to resolve our quality issues at the beginning of the supply chain. What caused the disconnect between our product and the consumer? It's very simple. All cattle were purchased on the average. There were no incentives. One price fit all. Progressive producers needed and wanted to price cattle on a value-based system that paid for each animal based upon value, not average. Superior cattle have more value, inferior cattle have less value. These incentives align producers to respond to consumer signals. Today, we have record beef demand. Producers designed and negotiated these grids with the processors. The information transfer between the industry sectors, establishing pricing mechanisms that rewarded producers who delivered the beef the world desired. I want to stress the greatest benefit and the greatest added value has been achieved by the very smallest producers. They have reaped the largest dollar value per head and were given market access. A possible price discovery that we could look at on the thinly traded cash market is to have all base prices of formula grid and alternative market arrangements become a part of mandatory price reporting.
The U.S. beef and cattle industry is arguably the country's most important agricultural sector. The sheer size and importance of the industry must be appreciated before implementing any proposed policy change, as the potential exists to impact many members of our society. It is not surprising the industry's markets are complex. I often describe the industry operating as a Rubik's Cube. The Holcomb plant event of 2019 and developments during the pandemic occurred in this setting. The U.S. meat industry sells products into 3 main market channels: domestic retail, domestic food service, and export markets. One of the most drastic shocks from the pandemic was extraordinary disruption in the relative demand across these three market channels. These post-farm gate developments directly impact derived demand for livestock and hence livestock prices. These shocks also highlight the need and value for better data and information. Economists have long recognized the substantial value of reliable, accessible, and timely market information because it critically guides resource allocations. Alternative marketing agreements, or AMAs, have grown in use in recent decades. Initial interest in AMAs from both buyer and seller perspectives originated largely from cost or operational efficiencies. AMAs present a multitude of well-documented economic benefits while reducing the volume of traditional spot market transactions. More research is needed on the types of information contemporary markets need and how to most effectively collect and disseminate that information. I will end by highlighting all revenue available to industry participants ultimately originates with consumers. Hence, aligning industry efforts with consumer demand is truly essential. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Hendrickson.
As a rural sociologist, I'm concerned about the impacts that market arrangements have on people and their communities. My concern centers around these relationships, the impacts of market organization on relationships between farmers, consumers, and communities, in effect, the social infrastructure that can make our food system and our communities resilient. And this leads me to focus on the broader impacts of competitive markets. Now, competitive markets exist when no one seller, no one buyer can influence the marketplace. It means that no actor has the power to define choices or prices or ways of participating in the marketplace. Competitive markets encourage a diversity of organizational forms, and they encourage multiple linkages across actors. They can also decentralize decision-making over food. So the power to make decisions about what food is produced, how, where, by whom, and who gets to eat it has become increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few people that are located in transnational agri-food companies. As has already been stated, the four largest beef packing firms were responsible for 85% of U.S. steer and heifer slaughter in 2018. 4 of the largest cattle feeders have a one-time capacity to feed over 2.5 million head. And this is in contrast to the over 750,000 cow-calf farms in the U.S. that have an average herd size of about 40 head. Now, while looking for profit, these producers are also concerned with their autonomy and well-being, as well as their other relationships with farmers and the community. So what are the impacts of consolidated decision-making in the cattle industry, as well as in the larger food and agricultural sector? At the farm level, agri-food consolidation reduces farmer autonomy. It means fewer choices for farmers about where they market their animals. My colleague Harvey James and I have argued that fewer market options constrains, as in limits or inhibits, the decisions of farmers. It constrains, as in compels or obliges them into decisions they might not otherwise have made. We've also argued that basic agri-food liberties, such as the freedom to negotiate and dictate terms, or the freedom to know, can be constrained when agri-food markets are consolidated. As I stated, I'm particularly concerned about social relationships and communities. Rural sociologists conducting a meta-analysis of the relationship between agriculture structure and community well-being found detrimental effects in 82% of the 50 studies they reviewed. A Missouri farmer once told me, "I used to look around to see if any farmers were getting out of farming so I could get their land to farm. Now I look around and I see I have no neighbors." This pandemic has shown us a number of flaws in our food system. I want to highlight that worker health and well-being are very important indicators of food system sustainability, and both were severely impacted by COVID-19. There was a strong relationship between proximity of livestock plants and the incidence of COVID-19 over time. Many of these processing plants were shut down due to COVID-19 infections, causing a backup of live animals to be slaughtered. Now, these animals have to be fed, which causes raising costs for farmers, or in some cases euthanized, which causes economic and psychological harm.
Mr. Tupper, let me start with you today. As a producer and a livestock auction operator, you see the negotiated cash market up close. What impacts do you see in the actual sale barn when there are fewer packers and other participants bidding on cattle during an auction?
We need more players in the marketplace, and competition is huge. We would definitely give up some of those efficiencies to have more competition.
Dr. Tonser, to follow up on this, when fewer packers are participating in these markets, we often hear concerns about market transparency because live cattle prices don't get reported due to USDA's current confidentiality rules under livestock mandatory reporting. Do you have any suggestions on how those confidentiality guidelines could be improved?
As it relates to the data that's submitted, currently that's done on a whole state basis. So the state of Kansas is one unit, state of Nebraska is one unit, and so forth. Something that's worth thinking about is whether or not that could be submitted on a more precise level. So think sub-states of a state or even zip code or something, which potentially, and please note I'm saying potentially, would allow USDA to report differently and address confidentiality. That way, their hands are sort of tied by the way data is shared with them at the whole state level currently.
Dr. Hendrickson, I really appreciate your perspective as we think about how we're going to move forward after the pandemic. And in announcing the framework for funding to improve resiliency in the food supply chain, the USDA identified 4 pillars of focus: supporting production, improving processing, investing in distribution and aggregation, and creating new market opportunities. So I'm wondering, what are some of the factors that you think that the USDA should consider as they design the program so that we can assure these investments have real impact and sustainability in the long run?
Thank you, Chairwoman Stabenow. One of the things that I think USDA needs to consider as they design this program is how will they build in redundancy and resiliency. And one of the things that we saw with the pandemic is that we had a very brittle food supply chain, not just in cattle, but across the board. We had a very brittle food supply chain. We know that local and regional farmers and businesses were much faster and more nimble at responding to the impacts of the pandemic than were far-flung supply chains. So what we need to do is to figure out how we're going to build in fail-safe mechanisms. So how can we have a redundancy in processing? And these should be priorities as USDA focuses on processing, on aggregation, and so on. So I think it's important to regionalize the food system, to find ways to regionalize the food system so we're not as dependent on these North American or global kinds of production-consumption relationships. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe we have Senator Klobuchar with us virtually. Senator Klobuchar.
That's right. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the witnesses, such important issues. We just want to start out with a quick question to Mr. Tupper. The pandemic painfully exposed high risk to our food supply. Senator Moran and I worked on the Ramp Up Act that was included in the December relief package to help small plants with inspection and get the inspections they needed and the like. How does having a more diversified meat packing industry help improve resiliency in our food chain? Because clearly the pandemic showed some of the problems.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. I think having more small and regional packing plants is huge, but I think that we have to look at it as more than just shackle space. They have to be sustainable, and we have to make sure that they're able to succeed. We have a history in some of these buildings, some of the small and regional plants, of it taking 3 or 4 different owners before they can be prosperous. And I think another onus on those small plants is when they go to sell that meat or try to get their market share, it's very difficult when you're dealing with 4 major packers that are ready to squeeze you out at any time, because you're trying to take a share of their business. So I think it's important, and I think it's definitely better for our security of our food system to have more small and regional packers. But we have to, besides just build them, we have to be able to make sure they can succeed.
Okay, a very good point. Thank you for that. In Minnesota, around 90% of our cattle leave the state for processing, and cattle inventories have outpaced processing. We'd like to make this work better. I guess I would go to you, Dr. Tonzer. What barriers prevent the expansion of livestocking processing capacity?
Thank you. It's been alluded to. There are many economic drivers of why we have the packing processing sector the way we do today. Economies of scale is the most often noted one. So I've used the term efficiency at least 3 times already today. That simply means the larger operations have a cost advantage per unit, to keep it jargon free. But I will also note that something that has been added, in my opinion, in the last probably 20 years with the proliferation of additional beef products is economies of scope. So the ability to not only produce a high volume and be cost efficient to run the plants efficiently, but also to be able to sustain large volumes of multiple types of beef products must be noted. And that is something that a smaller operation will have as a challenge.
Okay, very good. So I am working with the Antitrust Subcommittee on a number of pieces of legislation, as some of you may know, related to which would be helpful, I believe, in this market with being more pro-competitive and changing some of the standards we use to analyze not just mergers, but looking backwards at what's happening in industries. We're also going to be holding a hearing coming up soon on meatpacking as well as the food supply chain in judiciary that I'm helping to head up. Mr. Tupper, how important is it that the agencies continue to investigate the current cattle market dynamics and provide updates of their findings whenever possible?
Senator Klobuchar, I think very, very important, and we thank USDA and the new Secretary Vilsack for his willingness to work on these issues. He has stated that he's wanting to look at the Packers and Stockyards Act, and we definitely need these investigations into the antitrust theories to come out. One of the questions that always gets asked in a free market system, why aren't any of the big 4 packers trying to gain more market share? If it's truly a free market system and it's not antitrust, why are they not trying to gain market share upon each other? And that's something that always comes to mind. But yes, we definitely encourage and appreciate your work on that, trying to get these antitrust legislations worked through.
Senator Gillibrand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ranking Member, in New York, there's a very high demand for increasing processing capacity at small facilities, and farmers are often booking slaughter dates several months or over a year in advance. On Monday, USDA announced their new Meat and Poultry Inspection Readiness Grant Program to assist small and medium-sized transition to USDA FSIS inspection. And I'm hopeful this program will meet the needs of the processing facilities in New York. Mr. Tonzer, with the consolidation in processors, this has led to a decreased buyers and processing options, as well as increased opportunities for market disruptions if just one facility goes offline. Outside of the aforementioned grant program, what other options need further exploration to increase capacity at smaller facilities?
So there's a whole host of governmental discussions around subsidizing grants, increasing access to credit and the like. Those all have a place there. I don't think it's in my wheelhouse to advocate for one of those or not.
Thank you. Dr. Hendrickson, in your testimony, you touched on the need for flexibility, particularly in areas like processing, and you also mentioned the social value of communities and neighbors. I've worked to invest in our rural communities and strengthen our local food systems in New York so that more food from New York producers can get to other parts of the state. You also point out that consolidation is an agri-food system-wide concern in your comments, which is a sentiment that I share. First, can you speak more about how decentralizing and making our cattle market more resilient can also help our rural communities thrive? And second, can you elaborate about consolidation in the cattle industry and its connection to consolidation in the dairy sector and how this broad consolidation impacts family farms and consumers?
the investments that we can make in regional food systems have a lot of impact on communities, farmers, food businesses. We know that we've done some work around local food, economic impacts of local food, and we know that the returns to food, the economic returns stay in the communities and have a larger economic impact. And there's quite a bit of body of data on that shows that those returns are good for building the economic base of the community. But my concern is on people and the social relationships and what happens when we do decentralize, when we can build relationships between farmers and eaters. We start to build kind of this social infrastructure that I talked about earlier. And that social infrastructure is really important and necessary for communities. And one of the ways I'll just point out, during the pandemic, those cities that were able to use existing networks, strong networks that had a lot of social cohesion, they were much more effective in getting aid out to people who needed emergency food aid, for instance. And so that's just one example of the returns that we can have to social infrastructure. I don't think that this is just a cattle problem or a dairy problem or a hog problem or a protein problem. What we see are a consolidation across the board, and we need to really think about buyer power in that consolidation arena, and that starts with who's buying these food products, the Walmarts, the Whole Foods, the consolidated retailers. That's a buyer power issue. But it goes throughout the system. We see consolidation on the farm side. We see consolidation in processing, distribution, all of these things. And I think we have to address it in multiple fashions. And I think one of the things that we need to think about is how are we going to create a diversity of ownership and control where consumers and farmers can negotiate these relationships that they want that are socially important for them and their communities. Thank you.
Madam Chair, my time's up, but I'd like to submit a couple of questions for them to answer.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely, without objection. Senator Booker, and then we'll have Senator Grassley. Senator Booker.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. I'd like to put some questions towards my friend Dr. Hendrickson. COVID really showed how fragile our food system is. And we saw the system really break down in pretty stunning ways. Consumers were paying higher prices for meat, while ranchers were paid less for their cattle, but the big consolidated companies really made record profits. And COVID didn't create this problem. It really shined a light on what was going on. And many of the witnesses who testified talked about how there is really record concentration going on right now in the meatpacking industry. Companies like Tyson, Cargill, JBS, and National Beef control more than 80% of all the U.S. beef processing. I've been concerned about these extreme levels of concentration for years, and as you know, I've introduced a number of bills to try to deal with that. Bills with multiple colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Senator Tester and I put together a bill that would stop these ag mergers, put a moratorium on them. I've introduced another bill, the Farm Systems Reform Act, which would make reforms to the Packers and Stockyards Act, including a prohibition on meat packer ownership of livestock more than 7 days prior to slaughter, and a requirement for meat packers to buy at least 50% of all cattle from open cash auctions. The bill would also address a problem that Mr. Tupper described in his testimony and would stop the USDA from allowing imported beef to be deceptively labeled as products of the United States of America, which is so against the ideals, I think, that we have when we label something product of the USA. At least it's deceptive to the consumer. And I'll be introducing legislation with Senator Lee to reform the federal checkoff programs, which our ranchers and meat packers which our ranchers are forced to pay into a program that's used to benefit the giant meat packers. And so there's so much in the system that is clearly unfair, clearly working against producers, and driving many of them out of the market. And as you have talked about, hurting so many of our rural communities. So Dr. Henderson, If we actually use the antitrust laws that we have today, I wonder if you can show what breaking up these companies and this unprecedented consolidation, what would the impact have on farmers and ranchers and those rural communities, and what might the impact of stopping this kind of consolidation have on the resiliency of our food systems in moments of crisis, whether it be droughts or, frankly, what we just saw with COVID.
Thank you, Senator Booker. I think the big thing about resiliency is that we have to have a way to have fallbacks or fail-safe mechanisms. And what concentration does in the food system, it focuses on efficiency and specialization, and it doesn't say, oh, what's going to happen if we have like a pandemic or we have a disaster, we have these ransomware attacks. And everybody keeps saying that, oh, these are black swan events, but they happened and we weren't very well prepared for them. So we have to think about how we can prepare for them in the future. And resiliency requires a diversity of different kinds of forms, large scale, small scale, cooperatively owned, publicly owned, these kinds of things. It requires a lot of diversity in the system. And it also requires a different kind of connectivity, modular connectivity, where if you take out one node, it doesn't crash the whole system.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Grassley.
Madam Chairman, I want to put an editorial in the record from the President of the Iowa Farm Bureau.
Without objection.
Okay. Secondly, I want to give a couple takeaways so far from this meeting. We've got one witness that says we have a cozy setup. Don't pass any laws to affect any of that cozy setup. That isn't going to work for the farmers in my state that are mad about the $1,200 profit that the packers are making, and they get a low price compared to other people, and they have to wait 30 days in some instances to market their product. That is going to demand action by this Congress to take care of that unfair situation. The other takeaway is that I have not heard anybody justify this situation I just described, where farmers don't make a profit, the family farmer, and the packers make a $1,200 profit, and there's no benefit to the consumer. My first question is to Mr. Tupper. Being a cow-calf producer as you are, over the past 20-plus years, there's been a drastic shift in the purchase agreements. For where the early 2000s, more than 50% of the cattle were traded on a negotiated basis. But now it's only about 20% cash, maybe even less than that, I've heard. I've also heard from many Iowa cattlemen who fought to keep auction markets open and functioning as close to normal during the pandemic because they're so vital to price discovery in the cattle industry. So this question to you, does captive supply create more leverage for packers to pay lower prices for fed cattle in the cash market? And how does the lack of cash trade ultimately impact livestock auction markets?
Thank you, Senator Grassley. And it definitely is a definite yes. It impacts it hugely. When the Big Four can have all of that captive supply, so they do not have to go out and compete for those cattle, then they can push down the prices. One of the other things that I would like to say to Mr. Gardner, when we talk about the differences in cattle and prices, there used to be 4 or 5 buyers come out to your state in Iowa and look at cattle, and they could still buy those cattle on an up basis. They don't have to have an AMA to give more for those cattle. At any time, they can go to Senator Grassley's feedlot and say he has a superior set of cattle, and the base price that everybody else is given is $1.20, and they can bid them $1.25. So I strongly disagree that helps within the market. I think the other part of your question is that if we had more competition out there and they could not hold captive supply, then when we have high box beef prices, we would directly see the benefit of that. The argument that shackle space, there's no question we need more, but we do not get to see the direct benefit of higher box beef because we don't have competition and they can have captive supply. Thank you.
Okay. Also, Mr. Tupper, you mentioned that alternative marketing and agreements like formulas offer advantages to producers, but that they also adversely affect price transparency, price discovery, price competition. Iowa leads the nation in cash trade, nearing 60%, and they're frustrated that they're shouldering the burden. How do we know what cattle are worth in regions that don't have price discovery? Our small independent producers offered the same opportunities to market their cattle as big producers do through formula contracts.
And I would say definitely they are not. We know, and we need a contract library that tells us this. They definitely, some of the big corporate feedlots are getting a different deal than the small farmer feeder is. We can't get those same deals. They're being offered those, and I agree. Some of the best cattle in the country are raised in your state, come from our state of South Dakota, and are fed in Iowa, and they do it the cash trade, and they are shouldering the burden for everybody else. All of those AMAs are set on a base price. So if they're getting it up in the market, if the base price was higher, then those AMAs may not look like quite so much. The whole base price, the whole of the fat cattle industry would get more. Thank you for the question.
Dr. Tonser, in your testimony, you recognize the importance of reliable, accessible, and timely market information. Iowa cattle producers that I've talked to believe that the lack of cash trade in other regions and limited information reported due to confidentiality guidelines impede their ability to make well-informed marketing decisions. How can we make cattle market work more efficiently so that the small Iowa producer can compete with more transparency and agreements, help independent cattle producers get a fair price? That's my last question.
Thank you. So in my written testimony, I saved you from it today because I only had 5 minutes in oral. I outlined several candidate adjustments to LMR. My short response is, please look at that list. Some of them get at the heart of, we can't tell as an analyst at the moment how similar cattle quality are on formula versus, say, negotiated. And in many ways, that's because the formula bucket is a catch-all the way it's currently operated. So I think part of the honest answer to that is we need to pause and say, can we gather more information in a reasonable way that makes sense from an economist benefit cost perspective of doing so to understand the differences in the type of cattle, the relationships, and so forth? If those prices are very similar, once we account for differences in the cattle and the relationships, that's one thing. If they're not, that's a different thing. And we don't know until we understand more what's in that broader bucket. Currently, the formula is a catch-all bucket the way it operates. So you'll find in my submitted testimony is an encouragement of looking at that. The second part, briefly, would be currently USDA reports ranges, min and max. I think there's an opportunity to report more on the price distribution. So the example I used in my written testimony was maybe the 15th and 85th percentile. Let's understand more about the distribution of prices, help both buyers and sellers. We're honing in on the seller perspective here at the moment. I get that. Gather more information on that whole distribution. Some things like that are fairly feasible, in my opinion, given how things already work, if we could ask AMS to work with us to do that.
Senator Smith.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Thank you for this hearing and to all of our witnesses for being with us today. So cattle producers in Minnesota tell me that they feel squeezed by this marketplace. The lack of transparency and competition means that cattle producers are making pennies on the dollar in some cases. And meanwhile, consumers are paying more and more for beef, while the big processors, which control, as Senator Booker said, over 80% of the market, are seeing soaring profits. This imbalance in the market is exactly why Senator Rounds and I led a bipartisan and bicameral letter asking Attorney General Garland to investigate these anti-competitive practices in the marketplace. I also just want to thank Senator Klobuchar, who has shown important leadership on this issue as well. I mean, I think that we do have a market concentration problem, and certainly the experiences of Minnesota calf producers, cow calf operations really bear that out. I want to just note, I appreciated, Dr. Hendrickson, what you said a bit ago in response to Senator Booker's questions about how diversity contributes to more strength, more resilience, and more fairness in the market. And I certainly see that in the experience of the ag sector of Minnesota. I want to ask a question with a little bit of a different angle, and I'm going to direct it to Dr. Hendrickson and also Dr. Heron. Pardon me, I'd love to know your take on this. It's hard for folks to make a living raising livestock, but it's especially hard for beginning farmers and farmers of color. Cattle producers are not just dealing with market concentration and the power of the big meat packers, but also they've got issues with land prices and hay prices and the general cost of living, which keeps on going up and up. So the rising input costs make it especially hard for farm families that are just starting out because they just don't have a lot of built-in equity. And then on top of that, you've got the shortage of processing capacity for smaller processing facilities, and that becomes a real problem for beginning farmers and farmers of color.
Thank you very much. Senator Thune.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Tupper, help me understand a little bit here. You've heard some of your colleagues on the panel today talk about the prices are being simply a function of supply and demand. I think I heard you say that the livestock producer, in many cases, is generating a margin of maybe 1%, and that packers were generating margins of 80%. I think that was, if I heard you right in your opening remarks. So if you've got a food chain that consists of a producer, maybe in our part of the country, it goes to a feeder, but to a processor, ultimately to a retailer, and to the consumer. The consumer is paying, I think has been pointed out, record high prices, and the producer is going out of business, which means that the profitability in the middle of that food chain is hardly evenly distributed at all. Now, if there's a true market, supply chain, supply and demand regulating this, you would think that there would be some benefit that would accrue to the folks who are in that supply chain, and maybe at the end of the supply chain or the start of it, however you want to look at it, and that's the producer. So could you just respond to the whole question, or I should say answer that has been given by some on the panel to the explanation for prices, that this is simply a function of supply and demand?
Absolutely, and I think you alluded to it in your question, that it really boils down to competition. When they don't have to compete, we can talk about shackle space, and they can bring that up. That definitely is a factor, because then they can control it. They can control the chain speed. They control the price out the back door was their pricing the meat. So the margins can be very disproportionate. And I don't disagree that there are cycles. But as we look back through the history of the cycles, how many farms and ranches and how many small feedlots do we have to lose every time we go through a cycle, because it's just another cycle? And through that cycle, the big four corporate packers get filthy rich, and we squeeze out the small guy. And time after time, if you look through history, we have squeezed out the smaller guy. And bigger is not always better. And efficiencies are not always, shouldn't always be given up for competition. And I think that's some of the things that get overlooked.
So for a free market to work, you have to have competition. And from what I hear you saying, you think so I'm trying to figure out, if we're trying to come up with solutions and answers to what's happening out there, this volatility in the cattle market, these huge spreads that the packers continue to get that are driving producers at the producer level out of business. How do we fix that? It sounds like what I hear you saying is that there is a virtual monopoly. You called it an oligopoly, but virtual monopoly. And there's a choke point there where there isn't enough competition. So even though you have huge demand by the consumer and you have adequate supply at the producer level, that's not making it through the food chain in a way that saves the consumer any money. So let me ask you a second question, because you mentioned something about having a second bidder. Talk to me in your business what that means, how that works.
Without question, when we have calf sales, especially in the fall, is a big time. Many of our cattle move through South Dakota to eastern South Dakota, Nebraska, or Kansas, and we have to have that second bidder to decide what that price may be. I can tell you as a sale barn owner, when we have one of these black swan events, it affects us directly too. If it's on a Friday at 2 o'clock and I have 6,000 bawling calves at my sale barn and everybody's running scared because we have another black swan event, that falls on our shoulders as auction market owners to make sure that that market stays at a good place. So the only way, in my opinion, that you can have any true price discovery is you have to have a second bidder. You talk to any of these small or medium-sized feedlots that do not have already an arrangement with a packer, they do not get a second bidder, and they can't get one. And they tell them that you have to take this bid because otherwise there isn't a chain or a shackle space for you. So here it is. Or you can turn them in on the grid. We're not going to tell you what that price is until next Monday. So I think the real key that doesn't get looked at or analyzed is that the market power that the big four packers has dictates and controls the profitability through the whole sector.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for holding this hearing. Before I begin, I'd like to request that Nebraska Cattlemen's testimony highlighting their concerns regarding the thinning levels of price discovery, lack of processing capacity, and the need to increase market transparency be added to the record.
So ordered without objection.
Thank you. I'd like to start by saying that I'm not claiming or arguing that more cash sales will improve prices for producers. I am concerned with price discovery, and I am concerned with market transparency. Many witnesses mentioned supply and demand impacts on the supply chain, the cattle market, and sector profitability. I've spent over 40 years on a ranch in the Sandhills of Nebraska. I experienced firsthand the drought, changes in herd size, and I saw smaller regional packing facilities being shuttered around us. I understand the shift in the industry that occurred after 2016 and how we find ourselves with more fat cattle and less shackle space. I also understand that no one could have predicted hokum or COVID-19. Mr. Tupper, I thank you for your testimony. I love your points on the second bidder. I love your points about the cow-calf producer getting squeezed, but you left out our great Nebraska beef. Mr. Gardner and Mr. Tonser, Dr. Tonser, I appreciate your testimonies. In Nebraska, I represent every segment of the supply chain, cow-calf operations, backgrounders, feed yards of every size. We have packers of every size, including 3 of the big 4. I understand that every region is different. What works in one state might not work in another. So I see the merit in AMAs. I understand why they may be more popular in certain regions. I understand they provide greater economic returns as well as operational efficiencies, both for packers and for feed yards. In fact, that is why I've included a contract library in my legislation to provide all producers who want to diversify their marketing, but who were not lucky enough to have a seat at the negotiating table that Mr. Gardner references in his testimony, and they can then have access to examples of what already exists in the marketplace. Dr. Tonser, as the economist on the panel, I'm interested in your opinion on Mr. Gardner's testimony where he states that his customers on average have earned $92.71 per head in premiums above live-based market price because of his use of a value-based system. Later in the testimony, he states that cash trades can be interpreted as the base price. If there were no publicly reported cash price for Mr. Gardner to use as his base, he would not be able to determine that his cattle are worth that $92 more per head than his neighbor's cattle. Base price is important. Dr. Tonser, you highlight the value of AMAs to market participants who choose to utilize them. So how do you foresee these market participants setting the base price for these agreements in the future if the pool of cash participants continues to shrink?
So thank you for the comment and questions. 2 things come to mind. One is I think we honestly need to, as I noted also in my written testimony, assess if LMR can help us with the discovery and reporting and transparency component. That in itself isn't changing the percentage that are negotiated, right? I think that has to be kept in mind as well. Not that I have the magic list, but there's some potential helping points there. The second part would be is, and other testimony alluded to, there's other industries that have similar shocks right? Lumber industry and so forth. But I'd encourage us to go a little bit further also. There's a lot of other industries that have changed what their base way of doing business is. I don't think we're to that point tomorrow, so please don't overreact to my comment, but there's a lot of other sectors in ag to where the base that's used in how you do business is different today than it was 30 or 50 years ago. In a different way, over time, we need to be open to that. And there's other sectors in ag that have done that. We're not going to do that tomorrow on fed cattle, but I encourage us to at least be aware of that evolution that's existing.
I'd be interested to know how you would determine base in the future, because I think the cash sales are important. They provide information to those using AMAs. I don't think that they are receiving the value that they have, the economic value that they have in the system that we currently have. But they are important to be able to know what the market price is, what the have that transparency, the accountability in a system that should be benefiting every segment of this industry, from cow-calf producers to my neighbors in South Dakota, close to the Sandhills, to be able to have that across the board. We need every segment of this industry to be able to succeed. My time has expired, but I thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Chairman Stabenow, and thank you, Ranking Member Bozeman. I am thrilled that we are having this hearing today. I have been so excited looking forward to this, and I want to thank our panel of witnesses for being here. And, I'm pleased that the committee has decided that we need to discuss price manipulation, collusion, restrictions of competition, and other unfair practices in the cattle markets. I applaud American Farm Bureau President Zippy Duvall for establishing a cattle market working group in April 2020 to investigate and research the volatile activities in the cattle markets. And the findings and suggested that resulted from that working group's research are quite informative, and it should be taken into consideration. What we've been seeing in the cattle markets, rock bottom prices for fed cattle, yet sky-high prices for boxed beef, just defies the basic laws of economic supply and demand, and we need some solutions. We need some solutions, and we need some answers, and we need to act upon this. Being a producer myself, as well as a family that operates a stockyard that has had a live cattle auction since 1942, I'm getting hundreds of calls from producers, from beef cattle producers, that are saying, Cindy, what is wrong with this market? They are seeing their prices they're getting, and they're seeing what the prices are at the grocery store and that with boxed beef. Several of my colleagues have put forth legislation that will require USDA to establish a minimum mandatory negotiated trade in the cash markets by the packers. We have talked about many things, but I have never seen so many producers give me calls. They are busy. Right now, they're in fields all across America, cutting hay, baling hay, getting ready to put it in the barn for winter so they can feed their cattle. My 87-year-old father-in-law, I assure you, is fixing fence right now today somewhere because we are protecting our herd. We have got to be the voice to protect this industry. Mr. Tupper, your fellow panelists here, they seem to suggest that the AMAs are the solution to low prices being paid to producers. Tell me how an alternative marketing agreement between a feeder and a packer will benefit a cow-calf producer who unloads a gooseneck load of trailer load at your barn every week. How would that benefit that producer?
It won't. In short, there's no question that there can be some value, and we need to make sure that we get a good product out there. But there are other ways to do it than just an AMA.
Well, I want to be here because these producers can't be here, and they know exactly what you just said. They know that. They don't have a seat at this table. Farm Bureau was not asked to be a panelist today as I requested, but I assure you their chair at this table is not empty because I'm sitting in it.
Thank you very much, Senator Hyde-Smith. Senator Ernst is next, and then Senator Hoeven and Senator Braun.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to our witnesses today. And Dr. Tonsor, like you, I grew up feeding hogs and walking beans, and those are the typical things us farm kids do on our family farms. I, of course, grew up in Southwest Iowa, and I experienced firsthand the hard work that goes into production agriculture. Agriculture has long been the bedrock of our national economy, and Iowa certainly plays a critical part in ensuring folks have access to a safe and affordable food supply. And without transparency, we risk losing that fair competitive pricing. What would you recommend to achieve greater transparency in the market, and how can the market send clearer signals to both our producers and our end consumers?
So my response would be similar to what I've given a couple times, is I would encourage ongoing looking at how LMR works, and there's always room for improvement. Some of the things in my written testimony are easier, closer to the no-brainer kind of edge on that continuum. Others need further assessment. I made the comment about formula transactions being kind of a catch-all category. I think there's room to potentially gather information better so we understand what that is a little bit more. I can't sit here and tell you more without additional information coming back out. That's my best response, is to pause. And there are periodic reviews of LMR. LMR has been around for 20 years. It's reauthorized roughly every 5 years. Part of what happens is looking at how that works. I would encourage us to seriously think about that and make sure we are, to the best we're able to, while protecting confidentiality. That's embedded in my submission as well. I think that's important to keep in mind, providing as much information on the market as we can. I think there's ways to do that without mandates on certain percent cash negotiated and so forth. That's embedded in several of my responses that have come up today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Tupper, I'm going to turn to you. My mother worked at a livestock auction when I was a young girl. She was not an auctioneer, but certainly every Wednesday afternoon she kept the books for the folks in Stanton, Iowa, and it was one day a week. Us kids didn't have to ride the school bus home, so we loved it. But over the past 20 years, we really have seen a drastic shift in purchase agreements. And 20 years ago, over half of all cattle were traded on a negotiated basis. And today, negotiated purchases account for just a quarter of all purchases. Instead, alternative arrangements like formula or forward contracts have become more prevalent. Formula transactions are less transparent because they utilize base prices that are not publicly disclosed or reported. As a producer, can you accurately describe what is used to set the base price in these formulas? And then would knowing the base price and any premiums be advantageous for cattlemen?
Yes, and thank you for the question, Senator, and appreciate those, as an auctioneer, we appreciate those secretaries. That's what keeps us in line.
Yeah, that's a good one. Thank you.
I think the base price is generally sent in most of those AMAs, and there's very many different ones. And you said it, there are very many different categories to that. So we don't know exactly what some of those are. But the 5-state weighted average is often used as the base price. So as the packer can buy less than, as Senator Grassley pointed out, 20% in the spot cash market, and use that to set the base price for 80% of the cattle that are sold in these AMAs. And then he can tell those guys that are getting AMAs, like Mr. Gardner has alluded to in his testimony, that you make $80 or $90 a head. That's quite a significant move for the packer. They absolutely can control the base price and then give a little incentives to a few of the cattle, and then keep the rest of the cattle at that base price level. So I think when we set those base prices, that's where the bar has to get higher. We have a great product. We definitely need to segregate. I don't disagree that the better cattle and the better breeding and all the things that are put into that need to be rewarded. But I think there's other ways to do it than just AMAs.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I thank all of our witnesses for being here today. This is a tough issue, I think, for so many of us. Hearing all different sides coming together, certainly we hope to be able to sort through this and figure a way forward. Certainly, Madam Chair, thank you very much.